are we prepared? And how can we be prepared? I truly believe God allowed Andrew to face what he did for us, to wake us up, to help us prepare.
Our children are leaving the faith in droves.
As a result.
Oh, I got to pause here.
We're going live right now.
How can we raise our kids to stand firm, have a faith that lasts, and navigate such a time as this?
We're reporting that our nation's capital has just been...
To turn the nation, you have to take the next generation.
Today in the news, COVID-19 number.
I'm Jake McCandless, and this is my podcast, Stand Firm Parents. We're working together to help our children have a faith that lasts.
And now, here's Jake McCandless.
We're continuing a conversation that I'm very honored to have with Andrew Brunson, Pastor Andrew Brunson, who served in Turkey, planting churches, training, providing aid to refugees, starting a house of prayer for 23 years. Then he was falsely accused of terrorism in October 2016, which was an act of Christian persecution. He was held in a Turkish prison for 2 years and then released October 2018. And since then, him and his wife, Noreen, have dedicated their lives to helping others prepare. We heard his story in the previous episode. I ended by teasing and asking, could we see persecution in the United States? He laid it out there. So I asked him to stick around and talk about how we can be prepared. First, are we prepared? And how can we be prepared? I truly believe God allowed Andrew to face what he did for us, to wake us up, to help us prepare. So please lean in. Andrew, again, thank you for sticking around for a second round with me for another episode. We ended the last episode teasing about persecution coming to the United States. Asked you if you think it will. What do you believe that might look like here in the West?
As I look at our country, I think pretty much all of our institutions are controlled by people. They're led by people who are post-Christian, and they're becoming aggressively anti-Christian. And I think the hostility is rising. If you look at the country 30, 40 years ago, to be a Christian was something that it wasn't looked down on. In fact, it was socially, it was a help in many ways. And now that is, in many areas, is no longer the case, especially if you look at the more elite levels of society. And so they're not in the majority, but they control most of the levers in our country, and especially those that shape opinion. And so many people will follow them. And as I look at the hostility toward, I would say, we're supposed to say what God says.
Yeah.
And if God says something is good, I'm supposed to say it's good. If God says something is bad, if he says it's sin, I'm supposed to say it's sin. If he says Jesus is the only way to salvation, I'm supposed to say Jesus is the only way.
Right.
And I think when we do that, when we say what God says, people who are becoming increasingly hostile to Christianity, they're going to label this as hate speech. It's intolerant, it's bigoted. If you say Jesus is the only way, that's not very inclusive, is it?
Right.
And so the reaction, I think, especially in a number of areas that are very much contested in our culture, especially sexual morality and I think LGBTQ issues.
Yeah.
And so I think that especially in those areas, there's a reaction when we say what God says, and people will say this is hate. It's hate speech, and we do not tolerate hate. And so one thing I learned is that, and this can be confusing. Like I was accused of being a spy, of being a terrorist.
Yeah.
And I think, wait, how can you think that? Well, it would be too easy if they said we're persecuting you because you're a follower of Jesus.
Right.
Because you're starting churches in Turkey, and they didn't want to say that. That's why they were doing it. But instead, they will accuse us of being evil people. And this is what Jesus said would happen. He said, the world hated me. They're going to hate you as well. And they will say all kinds of evil things about you, all kinds of lies. And so when we are persecuted, we're going to be, I think, called a people of hate. They're going to say, you have a message of hate. And this is not true, but this is how they will describe us. And so what do you do with people who have a message of hate? Well, people will say, you can't work in this company. You can't study in this school. You can't have a bank account with our bank. You can't have a credit card with this company. And so I think the main pressure that we're going to see is social and financial pressure. And I think that many believers, the majority of evangelicals voted for Trump to be president again. And so there can be a sense of, wow, everything's going to change now because he's rolling back a lot of the excesses that we've seen in the last years. And this is good. I support it. But there can also be a false sense of security that because he's rolling some things back, that this is going to save our culture. And what I think is more that there's a delay. There's in the institution of government, he can have a great effect, and it will have an effect in our culture. But our culture has changed.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's coming back to what it was before. And so I think what we're dealing with now is a period of delay before the progressive left comes back with a vengeance. And I think that dark wave that I think is coming, it may have been delayed a bit, but it's still coming. I don't think we can avoid it.
I really think that we were seeing it rise 2015 or so, and it seemed like it just seemed like that's where it's going. And Trump's first term seemed to be a delay, as you mentioned. Maybe that's what's happening now. You touched on this. You talked about the social and financial persecution. I've heard you speak on it, that persecution mostly comes in financial restrictions, social marginalization. I mean, what does that look like? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so there are some places we hear about persecution in China and in North Korea and in Iran, and you hear about martyrdoms or you hear about imprisonment. And that certainly happens. In Nigeria, many believers are being martyred right now. But I think what you will see most often is social and financial pressure. And I think this is what we will mainly see in the States. It may go beyond that for some people. But I think that the main way that this will manifest, that people will experience, is the social and financial pressure. And this is enough to knock many people out. I in no way want to minimize how difficult that is. It's very difficult to be thought of as evil and to be looked down on. And I look at, I've been involved in Muslim countries for over 30 years now. And Turkey, for example, used to be majority Christian. The whole Middle East was majority Christian. And then Islam came and just engulfed it. And there were many people who converted to Islam from Christianity because of the fear of the sword. There was a threat of death for some. But the majority of people who converted to Islam didn't do so immediately. It was over a period of decades, even 100 years. And it was because of social and financial pressure, not because of the sword. I hear people say, you need to be ready to die for Jesus. And I say, well, yes, we should be. That's probably not the demand that's going to be placed on you. So we also need to be prepared to live for Jesus, not just to die for him, but to live for him in difficult circumstances. When I look at what happened under Islam, Christians were seen as second-class citizens. They were looked down on. They had to wear, in some places, different colors of clothing, which would distinguish them from everyone else. They were embarrassed and shamed. For example, they could ride a donkey, but weren't allowed to ride a horse. So numerous things that made them feel very much that they were second-class citizens. And then the financial pressure, there was a high tax on people who were not Muslim. And so Christians over time, this is a heavy burden to bear. Yeah. Over time, they just kind of slide away from Christianity, and it's easier to become a Muslim. And so I think that the social and financial pressure that will be faced in the States, what I think is coming. We already got a taste of it before. It was just starting to happen. If you had a biblical view on LGBT issues, on transsexual issues, things like that, you'd have a hard time working at a Fortune 500 company just 5 years ago, 4 years ago. Because especially if someone asked you about your views and you said you told your views, it would be difficult to be hired there. And so I think that the things I mentioned before, you can't work here, you can't study here, you can't have a bank or credit card. That was already applied to some people. And right now there's a delay. It had only been applied to some ministries and some individuals, but that could very quickly be rolled out to many people when the circumstances allow for it. And so I think this is the kind of pressure that we're going to face. And it can sound really glorious. Hey, I'm willing to suffer for Jesus. And it is glorious in the sense that absolutely in eternity, you will not regret anything that you suffer here because God is going to reward it. There's a great honor that comes with that. But in this life, you could pay a heavy price, and your loved ones could pay a heavy price also. Where they're frozen out of society, where they suffer financially. And that can be very difficult to bear. And that's one of the reasons why I have a sense of urgency that we need to prepare now, because I think most people in the U.S. we're not ready for it.
Yeah, that was my next question. Do you think the American church is ready for something like this?
I don't think so. And one of the reasons is because we haven't really had persecution at this level in our country before. We've just been very blessed. We've had, generations of faithful believers that I think shielded us from that. So I think the church isn't ready. And one reason, I think the church is already in crisis, actually. There's already been a great exodus from the church. Millions of people who grew up in the church as children now say that they have no faith. If you look at the millennials and at Gen Z, the numbers for them have dropped off, huge drop off in numbers of people who are involved in church. I heard George Barna, he does a lot of surveying, and he says that less than 5% of people who identify as Christians, I think even as evangelicals, have a biblical worldview. Of course, that depends how you define worldview, but when I looked at how they define it, it seemed like just some pretty basic foundational truths. And so we have a church, I think, already in crisis. There's the spread of, someone called it moralistic therapeutic deism, that the majority of people from the millennial generation and down think that basically their theological worldview is God wants me to be nice to other people, and as long as I'm good, I get to go to heaven. And so that's a very shallow belief system, and it means that it's very hard to correct sin. Hey, God wants me to be happy, It's not nice if I say that, something is sin. Why are you trying to correct my sin? This is making me unhappy and uncomfortable, and God wants me, the main goal is to be happy. God wants me to be happy. And so I think so many people think this way, that when they're confronted with having to pay a price, when they're told they're going to be thought of as being evil and unloving people, then it will be very easy for them to just slide into the mainstream of thinking and separate from the church. So I think the church is already in crisis. And also, I think many people have a false sense of security. Many believers, as I speak in different places, often I'm surprised it's leaders who say, it's okay, bring on persecution. It's just going to make the church strong.
Yeah.
And I look at China, the church grew under persecution. And I say, yes, that is true. Sometimes that happens. But sometimes, I've lived in the Middle East for years, and it used to be majority Christian, and now there are very few Christians. And so sometimes persecution silences the church. There's often, it's more dangerous than people think. And so, I don't want to put fear into people. What I want to say is, if you're not ready, then you're much more likely to be knocked out. If you do prepare yourself in the right way, then you're much more likely to stand under persecution. So I think many people, they have a false sense of security also because they hear that God is moving. Oh, look, there was just a revival here. Oh, look, Asbury just had a move of God or whatever. Yeah. And because of that, because they see God working, and God is always going to be at work. He's always going to be moving, even in the most difficult circumstances. But because they see some positive things, they ignore the dark wave that's on the horizon that's racing toward them. So I don't think the church is ready. But I think we've also been given a window here so that we can get ready.
As you talked about the church in the Middle East over the years, how, over time, basically Christianity disappeared. It seems like it's the next generation that is probably in the most dangerous predicament when it comes to that down the road. Your mom has an article, and I'm going to put a link in the notes here, that she wrote about preparing families. Can you tell us just a bit about what's behind that?
So my mother has a very kingdom mindset.
Yeah.
And one of the things she told me, she was allowed to visit me once in prison, and I'm sitting in front of her and I'm crying and I say, "Look, Mom, how broken I am." And she said, "Andrew, there's a long list of people. There's a long line of people who have suffered for Jesus Christ. It's a long line that extends 2,000 years. And my son, it's now your turn to stand in that line." And so, I didn't want to hear that, but it's the
No.
right perspective.
Yeah.
And she's always had very much on her heart especially to prepare children, what parents and grandparents can do to prepare children. And so she wrote an article with some of the things that she wants to highlight. And she did help me, growing up. But even when I was in prison as an adult, it was my mom speaking truth to me, some very foundational truths, and just having the right perspective. One of the things that I remember reading, and Richard Wurmbrand became one of my heroes. He was a Romanian pastor who was held as a prisoner for about 16 years under, communist rule and suffered terribly. And when he was released finally, he knew that he was going to be exiled to the West, and he drew together the children from the church and he took them to the local zoo in Romania, and they stood in front of the lion's cage. And he told these children, he said, your ancestors in the faith had to face the lions, and many of them were killed by lions. Are you willing to stand for Jesus even if you have to pay a price like that? And all the children solemnly nodded their heads. And I thought, some people would say, "How can you do that?"
Yeah.
What are you thinking? But, even children, we don't want to put, have them in an environment of fear. And that's not what Wurmbrand was doing. But children can make serious decisions, and I think that we need to prepare them and encourage them to have an allegiance to Jesus when they're young. And just there are a number of things my mother suggests, but I would just say one thing is that we need to not present always just a positive picture of everything.
Yes.
David defeats Goliath. Daniel gets out of the lion's den. But also to say, be realistic. Give them a heavenly focus, but also make them aware there is a spiritual battle going on. Jesus has said that Christians often are going to suffer. And when you suffer, it's difficult. And so to prepare them realistically, not putting fear into their hearts, but giving them a realistic view of some of the dangers that they're going to confront as they get older.
Well, that's incredible. I guess I'm going to do an episode with a lion tamer for this. Just absolutely incredible. The link to your mother's article will be in the notes, wherever that is, where you're listening to this, watching this. Andrew, you mentioned the church not being prepared here in America. One of the things I've heard you quote from your wife, Noreen, is, and I believe this, you said it from her, that she said she wasn't prepared, but she wasn't not prepared. And could you explain what that means?
Yeah, I think that when Noreen and I were held together for 2 weeks in the same cell at the very beginning, and I noticed that she was doing better than I was. And part of that is because we have different personalities. We're afraid of different things. But I thought she was handling it better than I was. And I attribute that to, in our pursuit of God over the years, I would be zealous and run after God and then I'd coast, and then I'd run, and then I'd coast. And Noreen was very committed early on to set time aside for God. And even when we had young kids, she was just very heavy schedule. She would make that a priority. I'm going to spend time just with God. And she wasn't having these amazing encounters when she's doing that every day, but every day it's like she's taking and adding a little bit more, little by little, to a reservoir. And it's becoming deeper and deeper, just a deep well. And then I just say, suddenly one day, unexpectedly, you go into crisis and she's locked away. And then she begins to draw from that deep well. And I think that that's what she means. She wasn't prepared to be put into prison. I don't think it's healthy for us to sit around thinking of all the terrible things that we could face in persecution. That's not a good thing. So you can't plan for everything. She wasn't planning on prison. She wasn't prepared for that, but she wasn't not prepared either, in the sense that she had built that deep well, and then it was there for her to draw from. And so what's really on her heart is to say the most basic thing. It sounds very simple and basic, but it's actually something that we often neglect, is just to nurture love for God, and the way to do that is to spend time with him. And as I look back, what took me through all the darkness and my breaking, even when I was in crisis with God, was the intimacy that I had built up with him over the years. And so, Noreen I had a deep well too. I had that to draw on, but hers was deeper than mine. And so I often ask people, how deep is your well? We have hardship coming. How deep is your well? Are you prepared?
I had planned to ask a practical step, but I think you just said it. I don't want to leave you who are watching, listening, with the question, how deep is your well? Andrew, I just feel this is a great honor to have the chance to visit with you. I hope those listening and watching realize what an honor this is. Thank you for standing firm in that difficult time, and thank you for continuing this assignment and helping prepare others.
Thank you. I'm very glad to have this opportunity, and especially to encourage parents and grandparents to prepare those who are in your care.
Incredible. How deep is your well? You've been listening to Stand Firm Parents. Stand Firm Parents is a production of Stand Firm Ministries in partnership with Life Word Studios, created by Jake McCandless and Brandon Harrington of Dime Collective. Again, thank you for listening, and be sure to subscribe, share, and most importantly, stand firm.